G'day, it's K-Rudd here. Now, all's fair in love and war, and even in politics, except when it comes to debt, deficit and recession. Now, Scotty from marketing has had a lot to say about debt and deficit over the last decade.
They're not happy that net debt, we've turned the corner and we've wrestled Labor's runaway debt. We came to office running at 30% a year, Mr Speaker. We've wrestled that to the ground and we're turning the debt around.
But when it comes to the last budget, there are two giant buckets of bullshit which I think need to be taken to task. Bullshit number one. Scotty from marketing says that Labor's debt and deficit during the global financial crisis was irresponsible. In fact, at varying stages he said it was crippling, that it was unsustainable, that there was a budget emergency. But that was when our net debt reached the princely sum of $188 billion. But net debt under Mr Morrison has now reached $1 trillion. But mysteriously, that level of debt is now somehow sustainable. I ask you. Now, bucket of bullshit number two. The spin line from Morrison and Frydenberg in the last day or two has been that the problem with our debt and deficit was that we had baked in expenditures in the past. That when we acted to deal with the global financial crisis, that we weren't in and out really quickly, that we left a whole series of expenditure items on the slow burn in the budget. That too is bullshit. You see, when we did act, yes, expenditures rose as a proportion of GDP. They went up to 26% of GDP. But the following year, they were already back down to 24% of GDP. Now compare and contrast with Morrison and Frydenberg now. Expenditures under this lot have gone up to 35% of GDP. Extraordinary. And 4 years later, they come down in their own numbers to 27% of GDP. So in other words, our expenditure increases were like that. Their expenditure increases are like that. Yet they tell you, they lie to you, that this somehow is baking in expenditures under us, but responsible economic management under them. Also, total bullshit. Finally, of course, what we did back then during the global financial crisis through the measures we took is that we kept Australia out of recession. And despite this lot now deploying 6 times the amount of net debt, 8 times the size of our budget deficit, we're still in the midst of a recession. Go figure.
Debt and deficit, debt and deficit. The debt and deficit, deficit and debt.
The debt and deficit, the deficit and debt legacy.
Bigger deficit and debt.
Debt and deficit.
Debt and deficit has never stopped being important.